Hi, everybody. I want to introduce John Titus. Hi, John.
Hello.
And he has a background in engineering and lawyer, but he has done for the last, I don't know, 7 years, he can correct me, a deep dive into our financial system, especially the Fed. But what I also love about John is he has read Stephen Zarlanga. He has a whole series of videos on YouTube, which I send everybody to. Search YouTube for best evidence, 2 words, and you will, any of those videos, you will learn so much. And one of them is about Alexander Del Mar, which is one of Stephen's sources, and he loved it, Del Mar. So, John, I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So, as a preliminary matter, though, I need to get a share screen going to do this properly. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my video so you won't see me for a minute, and then if I could do a share screen, I'll come back on. Okay. Okay. Wow, rough beginning there. Okay, my name, as Sue said, is John Titus. I do have a YouTube channel called Best Evidence. It does look at how financial and monetary forces are destroying the rule of law and have been doing so for some time. I get to the monetary stuff a little bit later. I'll get to that. I am a lawyer and an engineer by education and by training. It is an honor to be speaking here at the American Monetary Institute conference. My journey into monetary reform was rather circuitous. I backed into it. I had been doing a video after video on how banks were not being prosecuted for crimes, even admitted crimes. Neither banks nor bankers were being prosecuted despite the uncontested nature of the fact that they were committing crimes. And eventually I concluded that those banks had sovereign power. Let me explain that a bit. We know from the Nixon episode that really presidents do not have sovereign power. Really nobody in a constitutional republic should have criminal immunity. The president has a limited sovereign power, but he doesn't have criminal immunity. Nobody in our system has criminal immunity. There's an argument to be made that sitting presidents can't be sued while in office, but once they are out of office, it's open season on ex-presidents. And that is exactly why President Nixon needed a pardon or ex-President Nixon needed a pardon from President Ford. But banks were criminally immune. And if you have criminal immunity, that kind of in a de facto way makes you the sovereign, because you could simply expropriate, you can steal any sovereign power that you want, and you can replicate it. Say, for example, you could start printing money, you could raise standing armies, you could do all of these things that should land you in jail. But if you're criminally immune, you can plead criminal immunity and you can avoid prosecution. And that is precisely what is going on with the banks. Eventually, however, I got around to the notion, I was like, well, wait a minute. The banks just didn't get criminal immunity. It just didn't fall from a tree. The criminal immunity for the banks that we started seeing confirmation of in early 2013 had to have derived from something else. Okay. And I started thinking about it, and it was likely, I thought, to have derived from another sovereign power that the banks had somehow gotten a hold of. That led me in short order to Alexander Del Mar in the History of Monetary Crimes. I read that, and elsewhere Del Mar complained of banks and merchants basically requisitioning the sovereign power of money issuance. And he said quite clearly that had taken place in the late 1600s in England. And I thought, because I knew the Bank of England had started in 1694, I have found the right rabbit hole. And down that rabbit hole I went. I read everything I could. I had the old, the sort of piggy bank model of banking and monetary system in mind when I began. But I started reading everything I could once I realized that, my understanding was out of whack. Del Mar is telling me these banks have private money issuance power. What's going on? So here I am. And by way of that background, let me get into my topic today. And that is what made the Federal Reserve's actions in early 2020 novel, and where did that novelty come from? And I'll get into that in a bit. From my point of view, changes that occurred, monetary policy changes that occurred, major changes occurred under the cover of the pandemic. And I want to lead off with a clip from Jerome Powell, who we saw earlier. I'm going to lead off with a clip of Powell. You might have to listen fairly closely given the volume, but Powell, this clip is from April of this year, and he makes an admission about the national debt in the U.S. that I found rather surprising. So let me just get this clip going.
The debt is pretty high, 27 trillion or so, and the annual deficit is now about 2.5 to 3 trillion or so. Is that a concern to the Fed in terms of impacting inflation?
So yes, in the over time and in the longer run, the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path, meaning simply that the debt is growing meaningfully faster than the economy, and that's by definition unsustainable over time.
Okay, could everybody hear that? Yeah, just
Yes.
nod.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Yes.
Okay, super. That's a big deal for a couple of reasons. One, normally Fed chairmen, they're reluctant to talk about fiscal policy. They're reluctant to talk about national debt. And number two, usually when you get any public official, whether it's Treasury, Federal Reserve, they always say, no, the debt is completely under control. But now with that clip, we have the camel's nose under the tent. He says elsewhere in the clip, the level of the debt per se is not the problem. You heard him say it's really the path of the debt. The debt is growing at a rate that's meaningfully faster than the economy, and that's the problem. So that's what, according to Jerome Powell, we can debate about what that path is and what it means, but certainly it's undisputed now that the debt is growing faster than we can pay, and so that much, and it was, I would say, is at this point undisputed. There's a problem with the debt, and Powell himself is acknowledging it. So that was just this April, and now I want to talk about what happened during the pandemic. You probably already know, given your attendance at this conference, that in January or March of 2020, right before the Fed went berserk, the balance sheet was sitting at about $4.2 trillion. And by the first week in June, it was at $7.2 trillion. The Fed, in other words, added $3 trillion to the balance sheet in the space of a few weeks. Today, the balance sheet is sitting at $8.6 trillion. Despite the magnitude of those numbers, however, that's really not new. The amount is new, yes. The balance sheet is hitting new highs every day. But the exploding balance sheet is actually a trick we had seen before. We saw the balance sheet blow up back in the global financial crisis between September of 2008 and November of 2008. So the size per se of the Fed's balance sheet during the pandemic isn't new. And really neither is the huge splash, the huge increase in the size of the balance sheet. What is new is that during the pandemic, when the Fed added $4.5 trillion to the balance sheet, okay, it increased reserves, the Fed did that in a way that forced the parallel and simultaneous addition of $4.5 trillion to the retail money supply. That part is new. In the Fed's long history in electronic bank money before the pandemic, it had never directly intervened in the retail money supply, but that's exactly what it did during the pandemic. And to understand the significance of what went on there, you really need to understand the difference between the retail money supply, which is the money supply that we use, and the wholesale money supply, which is the money supply that exists but with central banks and the people who bank at central banks. They are not the same. Those two things are very different. They're very different. So what am I talking about here? So what I want to do is I want to switch over to a keynote, and I want to look at the split circuit monetary system. I don't mean the double circuit monetary system. I think just having heard that is somewhat different. I'm talking about the split circuit monetary system. And when I say split circuit, I am borrowing that term from Joseph Huber, who wrote a book in 2017 called Sovereign Money. In chapter 4, he talks about the split circuit monetary system, and that is really when the penny began to drop for me. Like, wait a minute, reserves are different. So let's just get into it. What am I talking about? As an initial matter, I am talking about a circuit. I mean digital money, electronic money. I am not talking about physical money. I am not talking about cash. That is not part of this discussion. I am talking about the split circuit monetary system. What is the split circuit? Literally, it is two circuits. There is, on the one hand, our circuit, which is the retail circuit, and on the other hand, the wholesale circuit. That's the one where the Fed and other central banks play in. They don't play in the retail monetary circuit. The retail monetary circuit is private. I'll get to that in a minute. The wholesale monetary circuit is public. I will also get to that. I want to choose team colors now and stay consistent with them. The private retail monetary circuit is red. Just think of it, that's like the lifeblood of the economy. The Fed, the central bank, the public monetary circuit, that is blue. And we're going to stick with that convention throughout from this point forward. The private monetary circuit, it's called private because the issuer of money in this circuit is commercial banks. Commercial banks are private banks. They might be publicly traded, however, they are undoubtedly private entities. They issue money when they make loans. They lend it into a network of bank money users. So when banks create money, they create money when they issue loans, and money gets destroyed when those loans gets paid back. Let me say this just up front. I got hung up on this because I was like, well, I have electronic money in my bank account, and I didn't borrow the money. But undoubtedly, the money in my bank account, despite the fact that it's not borrowed, it was sourced in a loan somewhere up the chain. If you could trace every dollar in my account from like in a begat up the chain, just if I could do that, I would find a loan sitting at the top at the provenance of that money. Anyway, back to split circuit monetary system. For a long time, there was a dispute about whether banks were creating money out of thin air or whether they were getting it from vaults. But that dispute in my mind was put to rest forever in 2014 when Professor Richard Werner published a paper called Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing? I was so blown away by this paper that I made a video out of it called Mommy, Where Does Money Come From? I simplify his paper quite a bit, evidently to the consternation of Professor Werner, who emailed me with some complaints, but be that as it may, I simplify it and talk about it. And it's undisputed that money is created out of thin air by banks when they lend. Who uses the retail circuit? Broadly speaking, it is non-bank entities. So mom and pop businesses, manufacturing concerns, really any business that's not a commercial bank. So including hedge funds and insurance companies and whatnot. So you have the businesses on the one hand, so long as they are not banks, commercial banks. And on the other hand, you have people like you and me just to complete that circuit. And that is really completes the private retail banking circuit. There are 4,336 commercial banks, according to the latest FDIC Statistics at a Glance report. All 4,300 of them are chugging away, creating money. And that's the private circuit. Let's talk briefly about the public circuit. It is called public because the issuer of money here is the Fed, the Federal Reserve, which according to the official story, which I am not going to dispute here, but according to the official story, the Federal Reserve is a public entity. It was created by Congress in 1913, pursuant to Article 1 of the Constitution. And that, according to, like I say, the official story, makes it a public entity. It is certainly leveraging the constitutional authority to issue money, and that's that. Whether the actual issuers are public or private is a different question, but that doesn't concern us here. Who uses the public circuit? In general, there are three classes of users. There are other central banks like the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, so on and so forth. Another big class of users is the U.S. government, including, most importantly, the Treasury. And the third and largest users of central bank money on the wholesale circuit are commercial banks. Commercial banks use money in the wholesale circuit, and they issue money in the retail circuit. They are the linchpin of the system. There are 12 Federal Reserve banks. They are regional. Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bank of Chicago, Bank of San Francisco, Richmond, Dallas, Minneapolis, so on and so forth. All 12 of those banks are issuing money. They're creating it against debt, to be sure, but also to be sure that it is a spreadsheet entry. It is created out of thin air. And that really finishes the public circuit, which is that in conjunction with the private circuit is our entire monetary system. Now, I want to talk briefly about nomenclature. In the private retail circuit, we can call the money bank money. It is denominated in dollars, to be sure. And in the public circuit, the money, the electronic money, is called reserves. And remember, that's what we're talking about, electronic money. Bank money and reserves are both denominated in dollars. Dollar for dollar, they are the same. However, they exist in two different circuits. I do not have an account at the Federal Reserve. Neither do you. Reserves will do you no good. We need bank money to operate. We need bank. We transact our business in bank money. Commercial banks transact in reserves. I mean, that's how it works. All of the money, regardless of where it is on deposit. In the retail circuit, there are 4,336 commercial banks with deposit accounts. The sum of those deposit accounts is tabulated every week in the Fed's H.8 report. It is tabulated Wednesday and published Thursday, I believe. Reserves is largely the same thing. Also kept on deposit at 12 regional Federal Reserve private banks. That's reported every week. In the H.4.1 report, that right there ought to indicate to you that there are really two different circuits. There are two separate reports for two different systems of deposits. Okay, now let's talk about that system. We've looked at the split circuit monetary system, and now we want to know, let's look at the difference between the two monetary circuits with two different sets of deposit. Let's look at graphs of deposits in those two different circuits. Our private circuit being red, the retail circuit, and the public circuit being blue. Let's just take a look at those. I've got some graphs here. I'll go through quickly. I know we're running a little bit behind. Give me a second here. Get that out of the way. Right before I started, my graphs blew up on me, and I had to fix them at the last minute. Anyway, here we go. I think I got them. Let's get into it. This is the graph of the red line is the retail money, and the blue line is the deposits on account at the Fed. Those are reserves. So red, bank money, blue, reserves. You can see here, I am on the Federal Reserve website, the FRED website. You can see that here up in this corner, upper left-hand corner. That's FRED. That's the St. Louis Federal Reserve's website. This little box, follow me around here, that is called the tooltip. It's a good, really useful tool to have because whenever you're on a graph, you could see wherever you are, and you can look and see what number you're looking at. So you can tell how many reserves are here at this point in time just by looking in this tooltip. It is an extremely useful tool. I may not be the biggest fan of the Fed, however, I am the biggest fan of the St. Louis Federal Reserve website, the FRED. A couple other things about this graph. I have started it here December 18th, 2002, because that is when the Fed began reporting this blue line, this data. And I have ended this graph, you could see September 4th, 2019. I will explain why I did that momentarily. A couple more observations about this before we move on. Number one, the retail monetary circuit, the sum of deposits, is a linear relationship. That's a straight line. It just keeps trucking no matter what. And more importantly for our purposes, the red line, the retail monetary money supply at commercial banks, it does what it does regardless of what happens with reserves. As everybody here knows, the reserves were basically zero. They were basically used only to settle transactions up until the global financial crisis. That was a banking crisis. The banks were bankrupt. And so this here, when the Fed began adding money to the reserves and handing it to the banks in exchange for assets, that was a bank bailout. The banks were teetering on the brink. They needed reserves. They needed money to operate, and that saved them. And so the way that worked is, a mortgage-backed security might be sitting on Citigroup's books, and the Fed would buy that worthless mortgage-backed security, which was infected with fraud. They would pay face value, or actually a little bit more, and that was pretty much a bailout. But despite the fact that all this money gets added in this time, and this, by the way, the Fed starts tapering, it never finished. Despite the fact that the Fed's adding this money, the retail money, the monetary circuit doesn't really, it flinches a little bit. I'll show you right here, when the Fed first starts increasing reserves, the red line blips up a little bit, but then it reverts back to the linear trend line almost immediately and continues that way, and that's just that. Okay. What is next? Let me go to So September 4th, 2019, I cut that graph off there for a reason. What happened then? That is about the time the repo crisis happened in the New York market. And the September 4th, 2019, I picked that date because that is when the deposits on account at the Fed, that's when the balance sheet hit a local, a temporary bottom. They bottomed out. The Fed had been tapering, and then it reverses itself. And the reversal, the nadir of that reversal occurs on September 4th. The repo crisis starts, I think, the next week or the next 2 weeks, whatever it was. But the real significance of that is the timing of it. Early September. The previous month, the Fed had been hosting a conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. All of the monetary bigwigs were there, so the central banks from around the world are there. All the financial bigwigs are there too, the major banks, major bankers, major hedge funds. BlackRock is there. And BlackRock gives a very interesting presentation at that conference that basically tells the Fed what to do when there is another downturn. So let's take a look quickly at the BlackRock paper because I think that you are going to find it rather interesting. So let me cut over to that and I will quickly walk through the BlackRock paper. Here is the paper BlackRock presented at Jackson Hole in 2019. As you can see, it is called Dealing with the Next Downturn. It is dated, as I said, August of 2019. It was presented on August 22nd, 2019. What is BlackRock talking about? Let's just get right into it. You can see there that there is not enough monetary policy space to deal with the next downturn, meaning, interest rates are zero. You can't really jimmy the interest rate and get out of the next jam. That's not going to work. BlackRock says the current policy space for global central banks is limited, and it's not going to be enough to respond to a significant, let alone a dramatic downturn. No kidding. Interest rates are zero. So what does BlackRock say you got to do? Look down to the fourth bullet point, and you can see an unprecedented response is needed generally. In particular, what is needed is a response that will involve going direct. What does going direct mean? Going direct means the central bank finding ways to get central bank money. So you need to find a way to get that blue line, the reserves, directly in the hands of public and private sector spenders. Okay? That's what you got to do. You got to find a way, even though that had never been done up until September 4th, 2019. That had never happened. That's what BlackRock's saying you got to do. And if you go down a little farther in this paper, BlackRock fleshes this out a bit. There's a lot of palaver before then, but they say going direct, sort of repeating themselves, reminding you that's when a central bank credits private or public sector accounts directly with money. The key being central bank crediting private accounts, okay? Somehow crediting the private monetary circuit. So how's that work? Let's just see. You got to expand your monetary policy toolkit with an instrument that will be fiscal in nature, such as credit easing by way of buying equities. So you can't buy equities with reserves. Equities are purchased only with bank money. So hopefully when you start crediting, the BlackRock saying Fed, when you start crediting these private accounts in the bank money circuit, hopefully the people whose accounts are being credited will buy equities. BlackRock goes on with one more point. It calls this new money helicopter money, interestingly enough, and says, hey, you remember that little blip back in the global financial crisis when you started packing on reserves and it just blipped up a little bit in the retail bank money circuit? That's no good. We need the boost in stock of money has to be permanent. And that's just that. So there is BlackRock's advice to the Fed. There's going to be another crisis, and you need to respond by getting the blue line onto the red line. That was what BlackRock said. You can't make this stuff up. So now we want to look at what happened. What happened after BlackRock issued this advice on August 22nd? Well, as fate would have it, here is our same graph, except now I'm going to highlight this again. This is the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. But this time I have added the pandemic here. So let me just get the tooltip and drag it to when things started going crazy. So just by way of reference, this is January 29th. And if I back it up to September 4th, where I had left off last time, let me get it to there. There we go. So this is where the balance sheet bottoms out. Okay. And a couple weeks before, BlackRock had given its paper. And lo and behold, you know, what happens? The New York repo crisis happens. That's here. And then the pandemic hits. If you look lower right, that's here. And really, you could see that the reserves start showing up in the retail monetary circuit for the first time. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to just add a constant to this reserve line here so we could see it better. We could see the correlation better. The constant doesn't affect the correlation, but just so we could see it better, now you can see what's going on, okay? Let me zoom into it so we can all see it a little bit better. There we go. There we go. So here, just to kind of draw it, here's the balance sheet minimum, okay? BlackRock presented its paper around here just a couple weeks earlier. The repo crisis hits here. That's what's going on. The Fed begins expanding its balance sheet. Taper is over. And then pandemic hits right about here. The Fed adds trillions to its balance sheet. And voila, the retail monetary circuit snaps to and begins tracking very closely the Fed's reserves on deposit at the Fed. Now, you might wonder, why does this flag off sometime in 2021, sometime this year? Let me zoom in. You see that? Yeah, you can see it flagging off there, no doubt about it. My understanding, kind of looking at it, is that this really is, remember, everybody's got a lot of money on deposit at the Fed now. The commercial banks have tons and tons, they have trillions of dollars on deposit at the Fed. So if you add, so this line is reserves. It's very noisy, this line too. So what I want to do is I want to add reverse repos to this line, because what the Fed started doing this year is saying, hey, you deposit holders, you got all this money on account at the Fed. Why don't you spend some of that money on reverse repos? And that way it'll gin up demand for treasuries. So I'm going to add reverse repos to this blue line in the next graph. And there you go. Notice the noise is gone. And notice that we now have correlation. The blue line no longer flags off. That the Fed is still expanding the balance sheet, and the retail monetary supply is continuing to expand. And that's just how that shook out. Anyway, so that's kind of what went on there. Now, you just saw that was BlackRock's advice to the Fed. The Fed followed that advice. It got the wholesale money supply into the retail circuit. That much is very clear. Now the question, I guess, is why would the Fed do that? Why would the Fed intervene in the retail monetary circuit like that, really, for the first time? And I think my best guess, my hypothesis, is you saw the answer at the beginning of this presentation with Jerome Powell acknowledging that the debt is out of control. We have passed the point of no return as a country with debt. We are now borrowing money to pay the juice. What do I mean by that? Everybody knows that once you start borrowing money to pay interest on a debt, it's ball game. You can't do that. Your kneecaps are next once you start borrowing interest. That's not what the U.S. is doing right now. It has enough money to pay the interest. However, when you add the interest payment on the U.S. debt to the non-negotiable obligations, meaning to Social Security, Medicare, the debts that have to be paid month to month, that really can't be negotiated unless unless Yellen is willing to go on TV going, Social Security recipients, I'm not going to pay you. But that's a non-negotiable, that's political. That's not going to happen. Once you add the interest payments on the debt to the non-negotiable obligations, sort of the off-balance obligations of the U.S. government, we have now reached a point this year where the sum of those two, the interest plus the obligations, are greater than tax receipts. And we are in big, big trouble for that very reasons. And I think that Jerome Powell knows that, barring a miracle, we're never really going to catch up with that. And now I think that the conventional thinking would be the only way out with the U.S. as a debtor, unwilling to reclaim its sovereign function and start issuing money like it should, like issuing greenbacks. If it's unwilling to do that, and the powers that be are unwilling to relinquish private control of the monetary system, they're really the only option for the U.S. as a debtor is to try to inflate its way out. It's going to try to pay off today's debts with material less dollars tomorrow. And that's a tried and true formula. And the only way to inflate the currency, incidentally, is to inflate the volume of money in the retail circuit. The blue wholesale circuit's not going to do you any good. We saw that in the global financial crisis. The Fed packed on a couple $1 trillion of the balance sheet in reserves in short order back in 2008, 2009. And really, there was hardly any inflation. Now you're seeing inflation big time. The inflation you see, in my opinion, is not transitory. It is permanent helicopter money. Those are not my words. Those are BlackRock words from that presentation. It has to be permanent helicopter money. This is not an accident. It's according to a plan. It is BlackRock's plan that was implemented, and is BlackRock's plan going forward. The Fed even hired BlackRock in March of 2020 to help it buy assets. And so none of this is accidental, all according to plan. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Wow. A lot of deep dives and deep thought and history. Thank you. Do we have some questions? I'm going to go first to Randy Cook, and then to Marie, and then to John Howell. So Randy?
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, John. I am curious. I have a question about your familiarity with Title 12, Section 411 of the United States Code.
Wholly unfamiliar.
Okay, let me read it for you. It says, Federal Reserve notes to be issued at the discretion of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for the purpose of making advances to Federal Reserve banks through Federal Reserve agents, as hereinafter set forth, and for no other purpose are authorized, etc.
Yes.
I can show you my face, I guess. I'm just curious as to whether the actions that you indicate the Fed took in directly intervening in the retail money side might be considered a violation of that provision.
If I heard it correctly, and that being the first time I heard it,
Right.
it referred to notes. Right?
Federal Reserve notes, yes.
Right, notes. So the notes, the presentation I just gave concerned digital money. It didn't concern
okay.
notes at all.
All
Now,
right.
it's undisputed, though, that the one of the great mysteries of the pandemic is why did currency in circulation explode the way it did? But if it did apply to notes, yes, it would be a violation for sure.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy and John. Marie?
John, that was fascinating. Thank you. You have solved something which has been, I've been puzzling over for some time. My question is, do you know how they went about feeding the money into the real economy rather than into reserves? Because that's something I can see that they did it.
I do know. Not only do I know, I made a video about it. The video is called Quantitative Easing, the Greatest Sham of All Time. The way they did it, just to summarize, is during the financial crisis, the GFC, as I said, the Fed was expanding reserves, but it was buying assets from commercial banks. So that transaction could be executed completely in reserves, right? You pay Citigroup some reserves, and it gives you a treasury, and that's that. That's not what they did this time. This time, the way they did this is the Fed went to somebody like, say, CalPERS is a good example, retirement fund, and said, hey, CalPERS, we noticed that you have, and I'm kind of making up this conversation, but for purposes of telling the story, this is how it happened. Hey, CalPERS, we noticed you're sitting on a treasury. What a dog. The thing's not getting any yield. Wouldn't you like to trade that treasury away and put it in the stock market and buy Tesla?
Oh,
CalPERS is,
shit.
so CalPERS is like, yeah, we'd love to get rid of the Treasury, but A, we're not going to get a good price for it, and B, even if you were to buy it, Fed, you pay in reserves. We can't use reserves. That's like Chuck E. Cheese tokens to us. So the Fed says, hey, you know what we'll do, CalPERS? You bank at J.P. Morgan. What we'll do is you transfer the Treasury to us, okay? We'll transfer $1 billion, say, in reserves to J.P. Morgan Chase, and that leaves J.P. Morgan Chase with an imbalance on its balance sheet. Now it's got an extra $1 billion in reserves. And on the asset side, it needs a corresponding liability. And that's where you come in, CalPERS. What Chase will do for you is it'll create an account in your name for $1 billion. Then you'll have bank money. You have $1 billion, and you can go spend that money. You can go buy Tesla just like you wanted. That's what happened. That's
Oh
why you're
my-
seeing the mirror image.
Oh my God. Thank you. That's amazing. Thank you.
Great. And John Howell.
Thanks so much, John. That was really illuminating in many ways. My question is this. There's often been this discussion about who creates money, and as you've articulated, it's the commercial banks that create money, though some people say, oh no, the shadow banks create money too. And so this has led to sort of a quandary, an argument that some monetary reformers saying just changing the banks, just ending bank creation of money is not sufficient because you still have the shadow banks creating money. On the other hand, Richard Werner says, no, only banks create money. Shadow banks don't. They use pre-existing money they've gotten from banks. We heard Sergio Rossi say the same thing yesterday. What's your evaluation of that? The question is, if you do the NEED Act and you bring banks under control in the sense you stop them from creating money, does that solve the problem of creation of all money in the retail circuit?
No. Let me start with the shadow banks. They create they create an obligation that's money-like, but it's not money. Okay.
Right.
It looks like money, but it's not really money. Certainly, it is not. It's not legal tender.
It's sort of like an alternative currency.
It's like an alternative currency, but they're creating out of thin air. But it's like an alternative currency. It is really sort of a forerunner to crypto, in a lot of ways. But it's not money. Okay, bank money legally isn't money either. It's not legal tender. Okay. If you look at the legal definition of money and legal tender is set. Now that part of the code I do know. Legal tender is notes and coins, period, full stop. Bank money is not included in that definition. However, it functions as money because it is so widely accepted that the consent of the lender is sort of assumed, even though it really isn't legal tender. But bank money is way more money than is the money market mutual funds who are sort of doing the trickery you're talking about, creating money out of thin air. I don't think that the real problem to me is the usury at the neck of the snake. And that is, instead of what the U.S. should be doing is issuing money itself. I mean, it issues quarters, it issues dimes and nickels and silver dollars even. Why can't it issue, bills? The answer is it can. Okay, so the real problem is at the neck of the snake, and that is, why is it that the U.S. government could issue, say, $1 billion on its own, $1 billion in notes, but instead of doing that, it's borrowing that money from the Fed at interest. To me, that's the purest form of usury in the universe, because that's a riskless transaction. You might say, well, there's a risk that the U.S. fails, but you got to back that out, because if the government fails, they're getting their power from the government. So that one doesn't count. That's pure usury. That's what's got to end.
Thanks, John.
In my opinion.
Thanks, John. Now we have Carol Brule followed by Joe Polito. Carol, you're muted.
Okay. John, thank you for all your work. I appreciate it greatly. It strikes me that what we're witnessing is a giant financial crime. And I agree with you that we have to eliminate the debt system. Are you at Lafayette right now? Are you speaking at the Red Pill conference today too?
No, I am, but I'm not. I'm in Indiana. I'm in Northeast Indiana. I'm in Amish country. I talked to Ed Griffin. He wanted me to come there. I said I can't. I could send you a video. So I think that about right now, they're going to be playing a video that I pre-recorded.
Oh, okay.
It's largely like this one, but it's nice to be speaking at the AMI because I'm talking to people who know the monetary system
Right.
way better than I do. So I'm talking up, and it's much easier.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just, I was expecting you to go into the direction of central bank digital currency because I find it rather horrifying, and I see it as a larger crime that we have to stop. And I mean, I know there's a nationwide strike happening this week. There's all sorts of things happening in Switzerland right now because it feels like humanity is under a very strong attack. And I was just wondering if you'd seen David Martin's presentation because he laid out at the Red Pill yesterday, which is why I wasn't participating here yesterday. The criminals behind the whole COVID fraud, and he left out. He had the orchestra, the names and faces of all the players behind the COVID fraud, but he left out the conductor. And
yeah, right.
Big I was just wondering if you had any great insight as to that, and if you were familiar with his work and seeing the criminality behind all this.
I'm generally familiar with what David Martin does. He talks a lot about patents. I litigate patents. I've litigated patents for 25 years. I know patents in and out. David Martin is not a patent attorney. He's not an attorney at all. He's an inventor on a few patents. I would be very wary of accepting what David Martin says about patents at face value, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Hello, this is Stephen. We've run out of time, but let's take Joe, and that'll be, if that's okay, the last question, unless it's super quick, unless Seal sneaks in something very, very fast. But Joe, quickly, please.
Thank you. Maybe Carol missed it, but yesterday, the former the governor of the Bank of Spain was praising CBDCs. He said it would help to reduce the bad parts of central banks and democratize money more. Do you have in your analysis, John, any thoughts on central bank digital currency in that regard as a way of issuing money, which it should be the same thing, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an unmitigated disaster. I don't think it's money at all. I think Augustin Carson's the head of the BIS tipped his hand to as much in October of 2020 when he said, the problem with the $100 bill is we don't know who's got it. We don't know what they're spending it on. He said, but CBDCs, holy cow, that's going to be great. Well, we have total control over CBDC and where you spend that money. And what the example he was using is you're not going to be able to purchase drugs off the street if you have CBDC. But the danger is, of course, that's the camel's nose under the tent. They're going to be able to control every purchase. So if your social credit score is not high enough, or your environmental carbon footprint is too much, or whatever, you're not going to be able to buy any number of things. You won't be able to buy gas. They could shut your money on and off. It's not even money, to my estimation. It's what it is. It's a discretionary store credit from the central banks. I think that CBDC is extremely dangerous to national sovereignty. And where I'm headed with my research, I'll tell you now on my channel, I'm going to show you and prove that the way the U.S. is going to formally lose national sovereignty, along with every other country on earth, is through CBDC. I'm going to lay that out very clearly. So I'm horrified by CBDC.
I'm sorry, that's just crankish. This is ridiculous. The CBDCs, like anything else, it's a tool, and how we decide how to use it with our laws and regulations and government is what determines whether it can be abused or not. And it's just like anything else. A gun can be used for good and bad. CBDC can be used for good and bad. We're not China. This is ridiculous.
I'm going to step in here. I'm
yeah.
going to step in here, please, as a moderator. And John, I want to say this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope that we can join together in the future. And everyone, watch John's videos on YouTube. John, do you have a backup channel for all those incredible videos?
Yeah, I have the mirror channel on both BitChute and on Odyssey.
Okay, great. Invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
If this video was helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website